Good afternoon. Welcome to our continuous series of virtual voices focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our speaker today is Dr. Martin von Hildebrand, is an ethnologist and anthropologist who is known as an activist for indigenous rights and cultural and sociological diversity. He has focused on securing indigenous territorial rights in the Colombian Amazon. He has been awarded the Right Livelihood Award, the Scroll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, and the Order of the Golden Ark in recognition of his work with obtaining more than 26 million hectares of the Colombian Amazon territory to the local indigenous inhabitants. He is the founding director of the NGO Fundación Gaia Amazonas, ranked 40th among the top 100 NGOs of the world by the Global Journal. Over to you, Dr. Hildebrand.
Martin von Hildebrand has spent his life working in conservation. His work is a call to embrace indigenous rights and their traditional knowledge. As the founder of the Gaia Foundation, von Hildebrand worked to create the world's largest ecocultural corridor that protects up to 230 million hectares of rainforest stretching across the Andes, Amazon, and Atlantic coast.
One of the things we have to do is take other cultures seriously, take the indigenous people seriously, listen to them, make the effort. We don't make it. If we take Colombia, where we are now, and somebody like belonging to middle class wants to go deep, they go to India to learn Buddhism. And we have them here in the Sierra Nevada. We have 80 indigenous cultures. We don't listen to them. But we go to where the Beatles went.
Von Hildebrand says celebrating indigenous culture is not denying the contributions made by other cultures and moments in history such as industrialization. It is recognizing that the indigenous culture mindset has been missing for a more harmonious way of life.
Now, I'm not saying that science and technology are not important, but it's not enough. Because the problem is not technical, and not only technical, it's ethical. Who are we? What are we doing? Who is our neighbor? How do we have to live? How do we have to take care of nature? And this is something that should be learned in school.
With environmental movements across Latin America, the indigenous culture is being acknowledged again, and they are leading us into the future.
Because indigenous people see nature as a community, they see it as a subject, a communion of subjects. Everybody involved. It's a big community, we belong to it. And this is where the world is going. So I think we're walking towards the indigenous people, towards their way of thinking. They're not the past, they're the present, and they're going to be the future.
Michelle Vegas, CGTN, Bogotá, Colombia.
Well, thank you all very much for this opportunity. It is really a great pleasure. I'm sorry I'm a bit late today. Well, I was going to talk basically about indigenous rights in Colombia and indigenous territories and how we've come to the point where now we have recognized about 55% of the Colombian Amazon as indigenous territories. And I'm going to focus on the Colombian Amazon. If I go back when I started, when I was 29 years old, that was back in 1972, I decided to go into the Amazon. Basically, on the one hand, because of adventure, I had studied in Ireland. My mother is Irish, and I was connected with Ireland a lot. And I studied there sociology and archaeology. And then when I came to Colombia, I decided to go live with Indians. Why? Because when I was young, I came in contact with indigenous people. I guess I was interested in other cultures. I was interested in trying to understand another way of life. And I ran into a Professor Rahel Dolmatov, who told me actually to go into the Amazon. And that's why I went to visit an indigenous group that was not fully on. People had been with them and they were but perhaps some missionaries had gone by their place, but nobody really knew exactly from an anthropological point of view who they were. So I decided to go in, and I went into the Amazon, and that one goes onto the border with Brazil, and there I took a canoe, and I rode on my own with indigenous people giving me a hand. I rode for 6 months all the way through the Amazon, from crossing the whole Colombian Amazon. And it was an absolutely marvelous experience because I really stepped out of the Western world. And you're suddenly there as if you, as the travelers of the 19th of this, or the 16th century, 17th century, from Humboldt and people like that. You're really away from everything. And as I went through these territories, I was meeting indigenous, different ethnic groups. Nobody spoke Spanish. I couldn't speak their language. We understood each other just by smiles. And when I was halfway through the trip, or this trip through this, rowing down to the southern part of the Amazon, to the Amazon River, I came across a community where the people were, the young people were not in the community, the young children were not there either. And I said, where's everybody? And they said, they're in the camp. And I said, what camp? And they said, the rubber camp. And I discovered, or I found out, that these people were still being exploited by the rubber system. That is, that they were in debt for all their life. They were basically slaves. They had no freedom. None of their rights were recognized. The children were taken to the missionary schools and were being civilized. They were being taught that everything they had was wrong. Their culture was wrong. Their worldview was wrong. Their ancestors were wrong. Their religion was wrong. They were wrong. And they had to become like us and become civilized and become people, what they were told. And they were treated in a very rough way. They were punished a lot because they didn't learn properly or at the speed that they were expected to learn. And they were not really being taught anything except for not to be Indians and a little bit of arithmetic and a bit of Spanish. But really, it was a very strong imposition. And the men were all in these camps working for the rubber dealers or rubber merchants. So I decided to stay there for a while. And I said, look, I'll keep you company for 2 years to see if we can do something about this. And I did. And those 2 years became 50. And nowadays, they own 26 million hectares of land, of continuous rainforest. They have their land, their rights recognized in the Constitution. And they are setting up the governments. I started from the beginning when I started with them. And I sort of spoke that it's important that you get your land recognized, that you're the property of your land. And their first reaction was, the land doesn't belong to us. The land belongs to the birds, the land belongs to the trees, the land belongs to the guardian spirits. Because they believe in this, no? As we all do. I think we are all, to an extent, spiritual beings, or that is that we have a spiritual tendency. We all look for a spiritual satisfaction, a need, in the same way as we have an intellectual and aesthetic need. They express this saying that nature has guardian spirits. And what are they talking about? Well, basically, it is not the human beings that have made nature. It is not the human beings that control nature. It's not the animals either. Nature is a big community of beings. It's a big community of subjects. And they are all interrelated, interdependent. And I would say, even from a Brazilian point of view, there's a solidarity, there's a complementarity. And for them, consequently, there is something larger than us, larger than human beings, larger than nature, which they would call guardian spirits, the spiritual angle. And they don't give it a name particularly, but what it does tell them is that they must respect nature. They must respect the animals. They must respect the whole community to which we belong, this community of beings, of subjects. And this profound respect for trees, for the water, for the mountains, which you have to ask for permission. Of course you can use them. Of course you have to use them, as all nature uses other subjects and aspects of nature, but you do it in a way that you respect, you ask for permission, and it is the shaman, the traditional expert, people that learn this from the born. They are already chosen by another shaman, by another Jaguar, they call them, in the Yaqui, they call them the language. And these people, once they're chosen, that would have the sensibility and the capacity somehow they have this feeling, they consult the spirit, say this person can be a shaman, another person can be, let's say, the one that's going to run the communal house, the maloka, or another one that can be dealing with handling the rituals, and women that also run the whole gardening, the food, of course with the children, but also the whole community and the whole system of food and relationship with nature, how one receives food and under what conditions, which is very much a feminine responsibility, let's put it that way. This whole, they're specialized since they are born. When they stop being fed by their mothers and they start at the year of 1 year old, they are already told what food they can eat, and they're given specific food and specific training to become a specialist. And the specialist a shaman will have is in the same way as we think in a rational way, and I would say an individual way of our society. And that's why we talk about rights, and our rights are individual rights, in the sense that my rights end where your rights start. Each individual or each person is fundamental. The indigenous people are not denying that, but they see much more as a collective aspect. They see much more the relations between the people, the relations with nature. The relations are fundamental. It is not that you have rights and I have rights, and therefore each one has their own rights. No, it's you and I and nature, we relate together. And in the way we relate together, we build together. We live together. It's the relationships they are focusing on, because they believe at a collective approach. And as a collective, the relations are fundamental. And as a collective with nature, as a large community of which we are part, it is the collective aspect that is fundamental. And so all the rituals, all the way of life, all the way of dealing with nature, and therefore, of course, hunting and fishing and using nature, they have to restore to nature what they take back by either planting trees, because the gardens, after they plant the trees, and these gardens then go back into nature after 3 years of use. They use a garden for 3 years and they let it go back, it's restored back into nature. And so consequently, they have this relationship of a reciprocity and a complementarity with nature. And it's this relationship that keeps what they would call the fufaka, which is the vital energy flowing for all of nature. And those that keep it or are behind the vital energy is something greater than us. It is nature in its full dimension, which they would call spirituality, which they would see as spirituality. And the shaman who is trained, he is trained in the same way as we are trained to be rational and to be scientific in a way, and to cause and consequence, and certain ways in our philosophy that we are described, or our thought is described, our approach is described. For them, it was much more a systemic approach. It is a holistic approach. It's that all is interdependent. So when they have to deal with something, when they have to deal with the daily life, during the day they can talk anything and everything. Then at night they sit in the circle and they start talking about what they did during the day a little bit, and then they get into a myth. A myth, in a way, in many ways, is a map. Is a map. It is a way that carries you through important stories, but these stories inspire you and you connect with the spirits. They all have the stories about how people dealt with different situations, or how spirits, or how life dealt. And it's through the power of the word and the concentration, the meditation. Is one person, an elder, that tells the stories, the other listen, but everybody, it enters into a kind of a meditation in silence, in a profound way. They say the answers come down and listen to them. At night, that is the forest. You see few animals during the day. You see parrots and you see monkeys, but it's at night from 6 in the evening until midnight that all the animals come out and hunt. After midnight, the animals go back to their den. So it's these 6 hours that are essential. All the animals are out. Life in the forest is full. And that's when the spirits are there. And so this meditation in the circle they have every night when they talk. And they tell their myths. and they listen. Somebody, the person that tells them this can be quiet for 5-10 minutes, doesn't matter how long. You don't interrupt because you are talking with the spirits. You are connecting with the spirits. This is the way that they connect with the spirits. And what are they doing? They are connecting with their profound self in a way of understanding the world from a systemic point of view. So if they're going to hunt or fish or do something in the forest, by connecting, and the elders that know what's happening, of course, everybody knows what I'm saying, the elders can digest it, can see it, can understand it at a different level. They will say, don't hunt here or do hunt there, or we can hunt here. They will orient the people. They're saying the spirits allow it because they are saying that if I affect this part of nature or this part of the forest where I am, this territory where I am, the territory that they belong to, that they've been brought up, that their ancestors were brought up, that they know so well. If I affect this part, I'll be affecting another part. So I have to try and keep a basic balance, a dynamic balance of regeneration and of strengthening or protecting, let's say strengthening the forest, strengthening the flow of energy in the forest. So they think like that. That's the way they think. And so they are always looking into the forest in that way. And that's why we can say that the indigenous people flow and live with the forest and protect the forest. If I compare with our system, where we say that nature is a collection of objects, these are objects that I can use for my own need, for my well-being of my society. So I use the stones and I use the coal and I use the oil, but I use the trees, but I use the animals, and I don't know limits. I go too far with my economy. I go beyond the limits and I deteriorate the environment. And I come into serious problems that we are confronted with nowadays in climate change, for instance, but not only climate change, with the enormous loss of biodiversity, which is much more serious, much more dangerous and problematic. Indigenous people would not go there. They say we have limits. We cannot go beyond certain borders. We must respect the whole, everything in nature, because everything has a role. Even a mosquito has a role. It doesn't mean they won't kill a mosquito. Yes, but you must be aware. You must do it carefully. You must know how you're approaching this. You must respect and not go beyond the limits. And when the limits come, how do I know I'm going beyond the limits? Because I see the imbalance, and the imbalance brings illness. The origin of illness for them comes from the imbalance with nature. It is nature that is sending, they would even say nature is hunting us. Nature is sending an illness, is sending something against those groups that abuse of nature. And therefore we have to reestablish the balance to be able to live well. We go on diet, on food diet, on sexual reproduction diet, we control, we go through rituals, we try and balance out the energy by collecting through shamanism the energy of the moment and restoring it back to nature, giving it back by going through diets, by going through certain animals cannot be eaten for a certain amount of time, certain trees cannot be used for a certain amount of time, etc. We are looking to keep this balance. Now, this sounds perfect. Well, it's not perfect, as the indigenous people will say themselves. Of course, we commit mistakes. Of course, we have our mistakes. We're people like everybody else. And of course, we find some people that do the right thing and other people that don't want to. I mean, and when I'm saying the right thing is to maintain this balance or try to respect the limits and try to keep your diets when you have to keep them. But then they also suffer from an illness, a physical illness, a social illness, but they also have their unbalance. So the indigenous people have this understanding, according to my experience, according to what I've understood of their living with them and how they handle nature and how they handle this relationship. And so when I lived with them, I was learning with them in the 70s. And my dream to begin with was, let's go for 20 million hectares. That's about nearly the size of the United Kingdom. Get the land for all of them in the Amazon, the Colombian Amazon. And then the second point, I said the rights have to be recognized at the level of the Constitution. They must have their, and what do I mean by the rights recognized? Fundamentally, I mean that there must be a space to be different, a space to be themselves, a space to have their culture. Because we are, as a society, we are fundamentally colonialists. That is, that we believe that our answer is the best, be it in whatever we have, from a political point of view, from an economic point of view, from a cultural point of view. We think our answers are the best, and that the best thing we can do for the world is make them become, everybody else become like us. And of course, by doing that, we are denying other cultures. We're saying, well, you other culture, you're not civilized like us. You don't have our culture. You don't have religion. You don't have economy. You're poor. But we're going to go out and help you and drag you or bring you into our system. But of course, then our system becomes a dominant system, and we deny other worldviews. We deny other ways of being a human being, because there are many ways of being a human being. There are many ways of relating to nature. There are many ways of understanding the same problems that we all have. We all eat, we all sleep, we're all spiritual. We all have to have some type of an economy or produce to be able to live. Of course, we all have that, but how we do it, how we look into it, how we deal with it, how we deal with the nature, how we deal with rights from a collective or from an individual point of view, how we deal with politics from a hierarchical point of view or from a understanding. I'm not saying from a participant point of view, as we could say in a socialist approach in our way. No, because that is not the way they ask the question. It's not a question that we have to all participate, because obviously the shaman and some people are specialized and they know more and they can make informed decisions. But we are a community. Everybody in the community has to have a well-being enough to live from. Everybody has to participate in the responsibilities in the work according to their understanding, according to their knowledge, according to their capacities. So it is a different question. We cannot compare it with our terms of hierarchy or of socialism or whatever it is, because that's a different, we have a different way of understanding the world. We have a different paradigm, a different understanding. And so these people, as we went along, first, well, this was in the 70s, we did a study of the lands. We had a lot of opposition from politicians, although I'm talking about an area where there are no roads, where there's no flowing water in the houses, where there's no you do everything by boat, by rowing, or they live in an outboard motor, and they live in their traditional houses, and I lived with them. And I was funded by the Institute of Anthropology in Colombia. And as the 70s went by, and then I went and I completed my postgraduate studies in France, and then I came back and I was born in the United States. I was born in New York, in Manhattan. My parents were political refugees from the war. And so I was born there, and I had American nationality, but I realized that with the American nationality, it was not possible for me to get into certain spaces, political spaces, or if you wish, government jobs, or as we can call it, as an outsider. So I took on the Colombian nationality, and with that, I managed to get, or I was offered a job in Vaughan in the government as head of Indian Affairs. And that allowed me then to have access to the high levels. I became quite close to the President of the Republic of Colombia, Vigilio Barco, and just telling him stories, talking about the forest. It was a very difficult time in Colombia. It was a time of Pablo Escobar, of the drugs, of violence, it was a complicated moment in the Colombian history. I'm talking about 86 to 1990, those 4 years, and before that with the previous president, was Alfonso López Michelsen. And they would invite me to their office once a week to tell stories, basically. And they'll say, Martin, with you, it's a break. We talk about nature, we talk about Indians, we talk about other things, because the tension of governing a country like Colombia was complicated. And so by telling stories, they would say, okay, let's do something about this. Let's make this happen with the indigenous people, with the Amazon. And like that, with the presidents, we managed to get these 20 million hectares we had aimed for. I had aimed for this idea. And then I managed, and then the next thing I was asked to go and negotiate I managed to push this. I managed to encourage them, and they got the land rights recognized, as I just mentioned. And then we went to I was asked to go and represent Colombia in the negotiations with the ILO, the United Nations International Labour Organization, which is the one that they had given the responsibility to recognize indigenous rights internationally. And we managed to discuss and come through after long sessions, 6 weeks, during 2 years, with the indigenous rights, recognition of indigenous people's rights. And
Excuse me, Jessica.
because we managed to get the ILO, the rights recognized, and this was an interesting experience because as some people probably know, that in the ILO you have governments and you have the trade unions and you have the employees, and the indigenous people can't participate, but the rights are being discussed. But anyway, we managed to come up with a good document, and I managed to play an important role. I ended up sort of leading the group in favor of indigenous rights, and there was opposition on the other side for different reasons. But anyway, I bring this up because the rights were recognized, and it was an important moment in the history of Colombia, because this was recognized officially by the Constitution in 1990. And it was precisely the moment that we got in to discuss the Colombian Constitution, a new constitution, a referendum for a new constitution in 1991. But when the government ratifies an international agreement on human rights, this in Colombia is the equivalent of the Constitution. It has the equivalent legal importance. And so that meant that the Colombian Constitution could not go beyond, could not go below what was recognized in the ILO. And this, of course, made us, the Constitution was very powerful in favor of the environment and particularly of the indigenous people. A very powerful Constitution got there. And so then at that stage, the indigenous people's rights were recognized, which was the second main point. Then I set up the Gaia Foundation, Amazon Foundation, and I thought that in 10 years we could get their governments going. And so I invited the other NGOs that were working in the area. There were another 4 NGOs working with indigenous people. We said, let's get together, let's form a group called the Consolidation of the Amazon, Colombian Amazon, with indigenous people. And as I say, they already own 50%, a bit more than 50% of the whole territory of the Colombian Amazon, which was all rainforest. And that's where all these communities lived. We're talking about, at that stage now, it's 26 million hectares. And I went to the EU and the European Commission, and we got some funding, and then we moved on, other countries gave some funding. And our basic idea is that we work together, and our basic strategies, we do not bring in answers. We do not bring in and tell them how they have to do it. We create spaces to analyze, to study. It's their land now. It always has been their land, but now it's officially recognized. Now there's a limit that the outside world cannot come in and do what they want. The missionaries and the merchants and whoever it is have to come in and ask for permission. It changes the relationship. And I think many of the indigenous people didn't really understand what it was about, because they all felt it was their land and it was white people that went over there, the government, and had changed their laws. But it did change the relationship. It did change fundamentally. I would say that when the rights of the indigenous peoples are recognized, to a large extent, is saying you other people don't have a right to come in and tell you what to do, or to take over their land, or to dominate them. So it's really putting a limit on the encroachment of the outside world. For the majority of the inside of the indigenous people, they want on living in their forest, in their hunting, in their fishing, in their rituals, in their daily life, but without the outside pressure. Now they could start for the first time after all this time that they had been dominated, which for the last 200 years, and before that, well, there weren't that many people in the Amazon from the outside world, because the Spaniards, they came and they were in the Andes mainly, and the Portuguese were on the coast. So the Amazon was not that much, although there were problems, and they did come in and hunt the Indians for slaves, but they were dominated then through the exploitation of rubber, as I mentioned, and then the missionaries that came in. And missionaries were simply carrying out what the laws were saying. You have to civilize the Indians. This was the attitude of it back up until the 70s, 80s. The attitude was that all the indigenous people have to be integrated into the Western world. And that's why they were carrying out this one way or another, the missionaries, because they were the ones that went and took the education there. But now we are changed. Now we're looking for the rights of people to be different, the rights of people to have their culture, the rights of people to have their land. And as I mentioned, I was influenced by my mother's side, the Irish, who also had to fight for their independence from the British until last century. So there was this drive of independence, of autonomy, of a right to be oneself, of a right to one's culture, which also I carried in me, or I felt strongly. But anyway, so I was saying that we thought in 10 years we could set up the government. And we got the funding, and we did. But it takes much more time. It takes so long that even we're still trying to set up governments in the Western world. We're still, I mean, setting up a government is a complicated thing. And keeping it going and finding answers. We did not bring in answers. They had to build their answers. Because if we brought in the answers, we would be basically what I call colonialist. That is, what I mean by a colonialist to a large extent is that if it's the people, the local people in particular of a different ethnic group, if it's their agenda, and they decide which way they want to go. I can say, I'm going to stay and give you a hand, or I can say, I'm going to go away because I don't like your agenda. That's my independence. That's my freedom. But I cannot tell them which way they have to go, because if I'm setting the agenda, again, we're falling back into I'm ruling them or dominating, or I have a colonialist approach. So it takes time. The indigenous people have a different rhythm. You'd go up to the communities and you'd sit there and have a good chat for, let's say, a week or 10 days. And then say, okay, Martin, we're going to think about this, and say, okay, I'll come back in a month's time. And then you go to another community, and you go to another community, and you go around like that, and then you come back, and what have you thought? And slowly you build this. And it was a new world, and it's an intercultural world, which makes it all the more difficult, because you're not talking just about their culture, about their traditional way of approach, but how are you going to relate with the outside world, an outside world which has denied them and still has the basic attitude of looking down on the indigenous people. How can you create a new space of participation, of discussion, of respect? So during the first, we started in the Maloka, the communal house where the decisions are making with the ritual, with the traditional people. And some spoke, we want to talk about education. Others said, we want to talk about health. Others said, we want to talk about our tradition. Other people said, we're losing our language, we want to recuperate it. Other people said, we want to look at an economic angle or whatever. And on the basis of this diversity, because that's a fundamental idea, and the indigenous people, there are different languages and different people every 50 miles. There's another ethnic group and they speak a different language, and they've remained like this through the centuries. And why? I don't know. I can't say exactly. But if we look at a forest is diverse. There are different plants and there are different animals, and they all complement each other one way or another and live from each other one way or another. And it's diversity that keeps the health and keeps us going. It's not just one type of trees and one type of animals. No, it's a very diverse system. And their cultures equally, they maintain a very diverse system. What's very interesting is that they are all linked up through marriage. That is through this social structure in which if I marry somebody's sister, somebody's sister married with my brother, I marry out of the group, almost out of the group. So there we have Yukuna, Stanimuka, Lituama, Makuna, Barasano, etc., etc. 25 groups, they marry out. They don't marry in, which we call exogamy. Now this makes that they have, and they exchange. Not only do they exchange in marriage, they exchange in rituals, they exchange yes, generally in sacred instruments or musical instruments, sacred because all their music is sacred, because music is to talk with the spirits, is to transcend. But they are consequently a chain, is linked all the way to a diversity. But they achieve a unity in a respect and management for the environment. So they started setting up the government first in the communal houses where decisions are taken. Then they started connecting between all the different proposals. And that took us 10 years. Took them, because we were accompanying it. Took them. At that stage, I set up an NGO. We had some funding. We had teams. We had people working, and we were working 5 NGOs in different areas of this large 20 million hectare area. And from then, after the year 2000, we opened spaces with the government, which was not easy, where the government came to an agreement that it would not carry out any project in the area without going in this space twice a year. They would sit together, the indigenous leaders with the government, and nothing would be carried out by the government that did not go through this space where it was all discussed and approved by the Indian people. And sometimes the indigenous people say, no, we don't agree with this. We don't want this program of health because we don't have that illness. We have another one, or whatever it is. Or education, they said, we want our schools to be recognized. We want to set the schools up in our language, in our tradition, in our culture. And they managed to get the government to agree. How do you get the government to agree? Well, the way we had to play a role there as outsiders, and they would always tell you, look, Martin, you belong to that world. You have to give us a hand in that world to see that they come to terms with our world. But they also had, obviously, proposals, and they put pressure. And the best moment to put pressure on the government is when you're coming to elections. Because when there are elections, you have the local governor or the local mayor or whatever it is that wants his party to be re-elected. And so he'll approve many things that otherwise they wouldn't approve. But now they're trying to get the votes from the indigenous people. So that's the moment that you play your game. And we moved like that. And we got the schools recognized, we got the health program recognized, the indigenous people got the funds running it. It also creates problems when you have decentralization. You have the good and the bad, you have the positive and the negative, because you get the ambition, because you get a certain conflicts, because it's not easy, of course. I mean, we're all, as they say, we're all humans, and it doesn't mean that they have a magic response. They are collective, they do respect nature, but they're still humans. And obviously they get influenced by the Western world and the Western way of thinking, because all cultures, when they meet, they receive they exchange and they receive one another, and particularly the dominant culture, which is the Western culture, Spanish, and our economy is very strong and is very attractive. And so obviously the indigenous people are also tempted to fall into that space, or I use the word fall, or to participate or get involved. So from the 2000 to 2010, then they not only opened the spaces with the government, but then they started, and we all started working across the boundaries, that into Brazil, and collaborating with NGOs and other people in Brazil, in Venezuela particularly, and those two countries, not so much in Peru. And Ecuador is a bit far away from where we're working. But anyway, we started setting up an exchange of indigenous people, because from the indigenous point of view, the borders don't exist. Nature doesn't have borders. Sacred sites don't have borders. The spirits of the animals don't have borders. So to get together and to come to agreements and share rituals is something which is quite natural for them, although we have to do it in the middle of the forest, because we cannot go through the main border controls. And it's not that something done is being illegal, but obviously the border controls wouldn't understand at all why indigenous people want to hold a ritual on the other side of the border. But then with the rainforest, there's no problem, because nobody really controls those borders, so it's very difficult. So, because they're enormous, thousands of kilometers where there is no, you only have control on the main rivers like the Amazonas or like the Orinoco, places like that. So they started building like this, and they have built this for a long time. And then we started thinking beyond that, because in the Brazilian Amazon, what's very interesting is that along the Amazon River, all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean, coming from the Andes, the indigenous people say that life was born in this world, because they have different worlds that destroy, and then new worlds, and there are new manifestations of life in different worlds. And this world that we live in now is a manifestation where there are human beings and animals, as we see. But there was a world previous to us where there are no human beings, and the animals were very different, etc. So they say in this manifestation now, they were born in the ocean. The energy of life was born in eggs, and then it came up the river, and it started leaving the river and getting into the forest and manifesting itself in different ways. So you have animals, and particularly animals. The plants come from a different origin. They come from the energy of the sky. They come from the energy of the sun. It's a different approach. But with the animals, we are all the same fundamentally. Animals and human beings, we all come from the same energy fundamentally. And we're different manifestations of different things. So that's why animals are like humans also. And they have their own spaces, they have their own social organization, they have their own houses or communal places where they live. And so as they came into this world, they came up the river Amazon. And when they hold their rituals, in their meditation, in their rituals, they go back in meditation, of course, not physically, to the origins where they were born in the ocean, and then they come up cleaning the energy. So every year they're cleaning the energy of the world by going back and forth in meditation to the origins, and they call that the path of the Anaconda, because the energy came up the river in the shape of Anaconda and spread out in the rivers and the affluence of the river Amazon. And so it's not only because of that, it's because this area is the largest forest that is standing forest in the world, all the way from the Andes right across to the Atlantic Ocean, to 160 million hectares, going to 6 countries. It includes Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and the 3 Guianas. And they are all, in a way, not only connected, but the forest is continuous, with some deforestation undoubtedly in the foot of the Andes and some deforestation in Roraima, but it is a large mosaic of protected areas, indigenous territories. Other types of forests belong to communities, not types of forests, other types of systems protecting the forest, of legal recognition. But the idea now that we have been pushing for the last few years with the NGOs in Brazil, with the governments, with the indigenous people, is to see how all this can be connected, because we need the flow of the biodiversity. So it all has to be connected for the strength of the biodiversity, right? Respecting not only the autonomy, but the sovereignty of each country. In no way do we protect from one country. We have the same idea of respect, of course, and each one decides. We are, in a way, harvesting, because in Brazil, a lot of indigenous territory has been recognized and a lot of protected areas exist. We are harvesting the laws that already exist, the international conventions that exist, the different systems of protection of the land, the rights of indigenous people, bringing that and connecting it, bringing it together, and seeing how all this area can be connected and protected all the way from the Andes down to the Atlantic Ocean, which we have called the Path of the Anaconda. It's a big mosaic, as I say, and with respect to diversity, and of course it's a political mosaic, particularly because each country comes in on its own terms. But then we have the countries coming in on their own terms, we have the NGOs that work, we have the scientists that work, we have the indigenous people. Let's bring all this together, and we must include also the towns, because the towns is where a lot of political decisions are taken and influence the urban area. It's a big thing, but it is already come a long way, because as I say, already 65% is under some type of protection. And this is very important, not only because it connects the ecosystems, it's also very important because the rainforest produces water that is evaporation and transpiration, and it produces a lot of clouds, because it also takes the water as a straw from under the ground and produces more water than is evaporated in the ocean per square kilometer or per square meter, whatever it is. So it forms what we call the flying rivers, all these clouds which are pushed by the wind over to the Andes and right down to South America, all the way to Argentina, and also up to the Midwestern United States. This is producing flying river. It is producing water for the whole area. If we lose the trees, we lose the water. And it is most of the water of Latin America, because we are losing all our snow mountains are melting, and therefore we will be left without water. So it is fundamental for the future of Latin America, and I would say the planet, because all these flying rivers is the water cycle in the planet. The Amazon is extremely important, particularly this part in the equator, where it rains the most, because it's where the two climatic seasons meet, and that's where it rains the most. And this is fundamental. And therefore, it is fundamental. A lot of this territory is indigenous territory, and they have to participate fully in all the decisions and how this is going to be kept, this land, which they've been doing for thousands of years. And they have a worldview, which I think is fundamental for us, because what we have now recognized, what we call the rights of nature, or what we call the importance of nature, of this harmony and this whole structure in nature of the nature, if you wish to see it in these terms, is sacred, that we must take care of it as a community and not go on exploiting it as a collection of objects. So I think that the indigenous people are people of the future. We are realizing that we will not be able to solve climate change. We will not be able to overcome the situation if we don't listen to the other 500 cultures that exist in the world, that there are different ways of understanding and of living nature and living with nature and being nature. And I think, therefore, that looking into the future, I think the indigenous people are an enormous role to play. They are essential for building solutions into the new world. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Hildebrand. That was a wonderful presentation. Especially, it reminded me when I was with Marie Strong during the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And we talked about it, and we talked with the indigenous, and they were telling us all the problems. Anyway, we have many, many questions. So I will forward to Ariel for the questions.
Will preservation of the territory of Indigenous people help to save ecology?
How does it?
Will it?
Will it? Well, you see, will it is a question that you'll have to ask. It is up to us. It is us in the Western world that we tend to encroach indigenous territories. We tend to encroach indigenous cultures. And consequently, we tend to go in and make roads or exploit their natural resources or whatever it is. And we tend to underestimate the importance of indigenous people. So I think that unless we understand that there are different ways of being a human being and that there's an important way of relating to nature, if we don't understand that, and I think the young people are walking in that direction and starting it. And I think that when we recognize around the world in many countries and many places that we talk about the rights of nature, and that means the limits, how far we can go with nature and where do we have to respect nature. I think that is the answer. The indigenous people are there. But if we don't change us, the Western world, in our way of living, we're going to run over them. We're going to go, and as we're doing with nature, we're going to go on destructing nature, go on deforestation. We're going to go on imposing on the nature, like it's happening in Brazil, opening mining into indigenous territories. If we go on like that, it will not help because we are the ones that are destroying it. So we have to look at ourselves. It is there, it's an opportunity, it's important, it's fundamental. But we have to be careful. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, that was a next question, Ariel.
So the next question is actually from Jessica Williamson.
Dr. Vaughan Hildebrand, you mentioned that every member of the community in Indigenous cultures has a role. And I was
Has a what?
Has a role in maintaining the forest and the community. And I was curious to know more about, it is known that to achieve SDGs, we need gender equality. And I'm curious to hear more about women's role within Indigenous communities and how that supports gender equality and sustainability in their communities.
I can answer that for you, Jessica. They work very, very well together. They do not have the problems of dominant women or dominant men. They actually work very well together. But Dr. Hildebrand, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I think you've said it. You've answered for me. I would say I'll add two things. I think the problem of gender is not exclusively, but it is largely a Western problem, and perhaps a monotheistic problem. But it's a big statement I'm making, and perhaps it's not altogether like that, but they don't have this problem in the same way, because basically, yes, there is a fundamental difference. Yes, they do believe that the female energy, and therefore the women, but it's female energy, which you find in plants and in animals and everything. It's not gender. We should not say it's just between human beings in that sense. If we're looking at the relationship between masculine and feminine energies, it is in nature too. Yeah, plants and animals, and the animals behave one way and another. We cannot say that the lions and that other animals have a problem of gender because the females do one thing and the males do another. It's just that way nature is in that sense. And with the indigenous people, women are to a large extent nature. They give children, they grow food. They are very much nature. Men are very much order. they must be careful that nature does not fall out of order. I'm not talking about women fall out of order, but that the energy keeps on flowing and that we don't abuse of nature, that we don't overuse nature. But they both complement each other very strongly. And so we don't have that, the problem that we have in the Western world where I won't go into details, but we have created all kinds of strange things. But I would say that they do not have that difficulty. Now, it does not mean that you will not find it, because in the contact with the Western world, of course, the first people that arrived there were men from the Western world, and they started talking to men, and they simply wouldn't talk to women because they underestimated women because that's what they did in their culture. So you do have, when you're working from an anthropologist point of view or from a Western point of view, like I have worked, and that you do have an intercultural problem, you have to be very careful not to give more importance in the intercultural angle. Let's say, who runs the economic angle, who runs the education, who runs the health in relation with the Western world. There you have to be careful because we have projected a gender problem. So there is a problem, but it's not in their tradition, it's in our contact, in our projection, in our governments, and in our whole, whatever you might call it, development approach. No? So you do have a gender problem, but it is due to the contact with us, not so much in their traditional way.
And basically not when you stay with them, you find that they work together very well. I have not found any problem from that perspective, but thank you. Jessica, thank you. Ariel, next question.
Is there a way to give an education to Indigenous people without getting in the way of their culture?
Now that's a big question. That's a big question, and the answer there, again, is to be aware. We have been working with the Gaia Foundation from the beginning. Our attitude was always, we don't bring in answers. The answers are built by the people. Now, of course, all cultures, because since cultures are not static and evolve, well, of course, the Indigenous people have taken on a lot of elements from the Western world. Let us bring in, to begin with, medicine, because they did not have contagious illnesses. Contagious illnesses come from Europe because the Europeans lived with animals, and we got the contagious from illnesses mainly from domesticated animals, and the Indigenous people didn't have domesticated animals. And the Indigenous people are very clear. Animals live in their space and we live in our space, and even if you find a fruit that has been eaten a bit by a bird, something like that, they won't eat that fruit. And perhaps we could learn something about our present coronavirus pandemic. We could learn a little about from the indigenous people of how to relate with nature and what to eat and what not to eat and when and how. But anyway, they do need medicine. They do use, obviously, a lot of our tools. I mean, it's a big difference between a stone hatchet and a metal hatchet, etc. So, of course, there is an influence of the Western world. Now, in our questions of religion, there's no problem because we have our myths, and we can tell the Indigenous people about our myths in the Bible, and they'll say about their myths. I mean, stories are stories, there's no problem, and they understand that each one has their way to relate to the spirits. That's not a problem. They accept diversity in an open way, which we find it difficult. But I would say that we're not, when your question is to getting in the way of the Indian culture and education, the key word there is not to dominate, not to impose. Listen. And if they want to take from the Western world one way of thinking another, and that's their decision, who are we to tell them not to? But it's their decision. That's the essential. And that can be done. They are aware that for them to keep their identity, and they don't like the word, they don't accept the word imitation. You should not imitate, you should be yourself. Keep your identity. That is fundamental for them. And so therefore, and of course, all their illnesses, even if the Western world is there, it still goes back to shaman. All their rituals are fundamental. Their relationship with nature, illnesses come when you mishandle nature. So they're always caught up in their traditional values or in traditional institutions. So by living them, they are protecting, and they are developing now a way, because they realize also that the Western world does not have the best solutions. So they develop or they evolve towards the Western world, but keeping their values. They discuss this a lot. For instance, I'll give you a good example of something that we have used with them And it goes with a little story. We were there with, in one of these big communal houses with the elders, and the elder said, Martin, the young fellas are not staying up all night listening to our stories, listening to our myths. And when they come to the rituals, they don't want to dance in the rituals. And sometimes they'll even try and turn on a tape recorder and put other music. We're losing our culture. So I said to them, okay, what do you think? What are you thinking? What do you think should be done? What? And they said, look, Martin, we were thinking, what happens if we turn them into anthropologists? And I said, what do you mean turn them into anthropologists? I said, well, we see the way you tape, the way you write, the way you then put in a computer. You take pictures, the videos. Now, if they did that, we are willing to offer them all the information. We are willing to, we don't do it traditionally. That's not the way we do it, but we're willing to open so they can collect all the information. And perhaps like that, they'll get interested. And we did it, or they did it, and we supported them. You'd be surprised in a few years later, the women were producing twice as much food in the gardens. The young fellows were into the rituals. As I mentioned, there was all these different cultures, one after the other. They started comparing, said, oh, you use your myth like this, you do your ritual like this. I hadn't thought it would be different from ours, blah, blah, blah. And they suddenly got very enthusiastic about their culture. And then after 15 years, they decided, okay, we still have a long way to go, but let's write about this and give us a hand. And so they wrote in their language, and they took the photographs, and they produced a book. And then they had their own Bible, if you wish, their own book. And then they started with great dignity and self-confidence, the young people saying, I can sit with the government, I can sit with the outside people, because I have my culture and I can express it. I can say what I mean. So they were good with dignity, they were good with space, they were good trusting their own culture and their own way of being. So this is what we call endogamous research, or the research on their own culture done by themselves has been extremely effective in recuperating their self-confidence in their culture and in projecting it and in living it. That's an example, an important example. Yeah.
Ariel, next question.
Thank you. How has the pandemic impacted your work?
How have they impacted my work?
Mm-hmm.
Well, to begin with, my work is my life. And therefore, I have lived with them 50 years. Well, that to begin with already, I went in for 2 and I stayed for 50. That changed my life. And it has taught me that there are different ways of being a human being. It has taught me there are different ways of living with nature. It has brought me with a view, a holistic view, much more than individual view. It has given me a chance to stand back from the Western world and look at the Western world with greater facility, if you wish, with a greater breathing space, not being caught up in the everyday life of the Western world, of living a more basic life, not being so interested in having things. And it has changed my life, the way I relate. It's also changed my life on understanding nature. It has fed my spiritual life with nature as a community, with the flow of energy. It has given me a satisfaction, undoubtedly a profound satisfaction of, and I've been very fortunate in life that I have set out to do certain things with the indigenous people, accompanying them, and it has been achieved. I was perhaps hit or met the right presidents at the right moment. I was in the right place. And many times I ask myself, to what extent was it me or was it them? In a sense that when I remember, and I mentioned to you that they said land, they said it wasn't theirs. And I say, you need a piece of paper to recognize your land rights. And they said, look, Martin, after shamans went through all that thinking and meditation, they said, look, the land doesn't belong to us. But if you want people to say a piece of paper is needed, you, Martin, go and get the piece of paper. Piece of paper saying that land was theirs. And when they, to what extent in all this process have they put their energy, their thought, their shamanistic understanding of nature into supporting what I've done? Because I must say that the doors have opened where they weren't for other people that didn't open. I've been able, telling my stories to get across to the presidents, and they have action, they've recognized the lands. I have come up with stories, and for many people say, it's impossible, Martin, don't be silly. Don't talk about 26 million hectares for the Indians. Don't talk now about 260 million hectares and 1/3 of the rainforest to be protected. And I walk into that, and it's probably not, I doubt, because I know myself, I don't think it's me. There's a lot more happening there. And that, I think, to an extent, could well be an energy or something that the indigenous people in their traditional way are putting into it. So how has it affected my life? Fundamentally, I'd say. Fundamentally.
Thank you. How has COVID impacted your work?
How has what?
The COVID pandemic.
Well, we have been fortunate so far. We sent into all the indigenous people that we work with, which were thousands, we sent to all the families a kit, what we call a kit of well, first we explained where the illness came from, and they were very interested in that. It came from the animals, how did it come, how does it affect, and everything. And they all reacted, well, that is something we understand. An illness coming from the animal, from nature, we understand, because that's where we interpret illnesses. So they started with their rituals, connecting with nature. And we gave them basic kits so they could isolate themselves. What do I mean by that? Nylon, fishing hooks, a bush knife, whatever was needed. So if they want to split up for some time their community and go into the forest and live in the forest, they could, right? They had the means. They didn't have to come to town, which is generally 2 or 3 weeks away, or depending how you travel. But they didn't have to go where the pandemic is. They could keep away. And fortunately, so far, there have been practically, nobody has died of COVID. Even if they hold rituals, they haven't died. In my particular case, I only can talk about the work. I have been privileged because I'm in the forest, or I have a little house in the countryside, and so I'm away in the countryside. So in a personal point of view, I have been isolated from the illness also, and things have gone well, thank God. Obviously, it is, when it's concerned, undoubtedly, and a lot of people have suffered one hell of a lot. I don't have to go into details. And the other, sorry about that. And the other aspect is that the world is changing, and that's fascinating. What is will we become conscious? The big question is, will we become aware that if we don't change, we're going to destroy biodiversity and we're going to destroy the planet? And we look at the stars, and we look at the immensity of all the universe, and that we're tiny, but we are the ones that have consciousness, and we are the ones that have human beings, and we have life, and we're going to ruin that just because we are incapable as a Western world, not only to understand, because we do understand, but we're not willing, because we're interested in our personal privileges, and politicians are interested in their votes, and we're not willing to say, look, stop. Yes, we have to make an effort. We made an effort in the Second World War. We can make an effort. We can fight. We know we can. And that is the big question. Will we? I hope so.
Well, Dr. Hildebrand, we have one more question that Ariel is going to give it to you, and then we will have to end. Ariel?
I'll make a quick remark, excuse me. Since I'm not very good at these apparatus, at these things, if you wish, in the talk I gave, I can send you a few maps of Colombia. If you're going to use this further on, a map of the Amazon, and I'll say where it goes into my talk. So if you happen to use this, you can put up the maps. I mean, that kind of information, which I had ready in my computer, but then since I came in a hurry, I was incapable of finding things without.
That is a wonderful offer, and we will accept. Ariel?
Thank you.
So for our last question, do Indigenous people trust organizations that are trying to protect their rights? And what is the relationship between Indigenous people and other citizens of the country?
Okay. Do they trust people that are trying to give them a hand? Again, I'll go back to this rather general statement. There are people. Obviously there are some, it's interesting. As they get older, I mean over 30, for the Indigenous people, they say that when people start getting over 30, that they start settling down, both with their family and their community, and they think in a different way. And when they're young, they're on the move, they want adventure, they want to go out, they want to see other things. I think it happens to many people in many parts of the world. And of course, the younger people, when they come into contact and there are pressures from the outside for different reasons, different interests, let's say carbon credits and things like that, where it has become a big deal now that through REDD+ you can protect forest and get credits so you don't have to pay taxes on pollution or whatever it is. They offer them money and they offer them things. And then, of course, they're caught in this dilemma. They're caught in the dilemma between who is right and who is wrong in the Western world. It's not easy to understand our world. We keep on changing laws, politicians, we change all the time. And it's not easy. And some people will say, look, here's some money, and you will take money and you'll be free and spend it as you wish. Other people say our education is the best. Other people say, no, it's a different way that you have to be educated. So in general, they get a lot of messages and it's not easy for them to distinguish. Now, they trust us, not because we're better in any way, or that's not the point I mean by that. It's because we're there. I've been with them for 50 years. We're constant. They believe in us. And as they say, Martin, you know. And when I look at their culture, I know that I don't know, because their culture is very profound and it's very difficult to get in. I really have just peeped into their culture. I have a certain understanding, but I mean, it's enormous, the understanding they have the world. But what do they mean when they say they know? Is that together we came up with ideas, Martin, and somehow we have, and you've given us a hand and you've worked with the Western world and we have achieved results, the results we're looking for. So the shamans and the traditional people say they trust. They trust because they say, this person has done what he said he would do. They measure you not by your words, but what you do, by your actions, by your results, by the impact. That's where you measure somebody and you trust somebody. It's by the impact, their results, not by the way they talk and not by what they say. And if that's what they do goes in benefit of the community including nature, and not individualism and creating competition or disorder or divisions. So yes, they trust, but they come across with a lot of people of the Western world that they can't trust. They've had bad experiences, so they're very careful. So yes, they don't trust just like that. They have to get to know to be able to trust. That was the first one. The second one, I'm sorry, I lost it. You had a second point?
Yes, the second question was, what is the relationship between Indigenous people and other citizens in their country?
Basically, I would say there's a separation. There's a distance that sometimes can be physical or sometimes it is more mental and from a cosmovision or from an understanding of life. Now, I would say that in the case of Colombia and the Andean area, people are coming to respect the indigenous people a bit more. But you have a lot of people that own the land or that are interested in the resources, natural resources, and therefore they try to run over the indigenous people or deny their rights, or if you wish, deny their space, both culturally and their territories. But they are showing, not only with their worldview, but with their conscience, with their patience, with their insistence, and that they are open. The indigenous people are open. They are willing to collaborate with the West. They are not saying we won't collaborate with you. They are willing to share their knowledge. They are willing to share their patience. They are willing to build together. And the Colombian Constitution, 1991, basically the indigenous people participated, the rights were recognized, and basically the essence of that constitution is okay. Now the indigenous people will accept that the West came in and took over part of the country, but you accept that we have land and a culture also. And together, let's build it. It's taking time, but we're moving in that direction. Let's build this together. Well, for many people, indigenous people are quite distant. And so they have a sentimental point of view. If you make if you ask them, they'll all say, yes, we love the indigenous people. We agree with the indigenous people. They're great people. They take care of the rainforest. But it doesn't mean that it's a profound feeling. It is more of an emotional feeling because they're quite distant. The ones that are close, obviously when their interests clash, there are difficulties, but in general, undoubtedly, we have come a long way and we're still coming a long way over the last decades in a better relationship.
Well, I must say that I congratulate you very, very much on all of your work and all of your dedication to a group that I have always found to be fascinating, and always believed that it is a shame that instead of incorporating their respect for nature and working with nature, we are much more interested in destroying it. So I'm just in awe of your dedication and your life. So thank you very, very much. And I look forward to receiving your maps. And of course, you will receive our video from this taping. And the only thing that I need to say now is that our speaker next week is going to be Ippolito Liotta, who is the founder of Global Vision Group, a multimedia company for development of creative videos and production. Definitely the two of you should get together.
Thank you.
So with that, Ariel, thank you very much, and have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you all very much. It was a lovely talk. I'm sorry I was late. I got my time wrong, but thank you very much for the space.
That's all right.
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you too.